This is the new 2023 Lotus Emira, and it's the return of Lotus. Lotus has always been sort of a fledgling brand, on the market, off the market, and the Lotus Evora sports car recently went out of production. But now Lotus is back with new ownership and a new sports car, the Emira. Today I'm going to review it and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some great sales recently, including this Aston Martin V8 Vantage, which sold for $64,500, this fantastic Audi RS7, which sold for just over $76,000, and this wonderful Porsche Cayman GTS, which brought just under $61,000. We love Porsches on Cars and Bids. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. With daily auctions, great selection, and free listings, check it out, carsandbids.com. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Emira with a little overview of exactly what this car is. Like I said, Lotus's newest sports car and their last gasoline-powered car ever. Lotus, like a lot of brands, is making the transition to EVs. They've said this is the end of the line for gas-powered Lotus sports cars. The end of an era is this car. Now, the Emira replaces the Evora, which had been in production since 2009, if you can believe it. An incredibly long production run for the Evora, but now it's over. Lotus has a new owner in the Chinese company Geely, and they've developed a totally new car in the Emira. The only thing that's carried over from the Evora to the Emira is the powertrain. It's a 3.5-liter V6 that's sourced from Toyota, and it's supercharged for 400 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque. And this V6 is offered with a 6-speed manual transmission or a 6-speed automatic. Now, interestingly, a second powertrain option will be available soon. You can't get it yet, but it's coming, a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder from Mercedes-AMG. This will make 360 horsepower, and it'll be only offered with a dual-clutch automatic transmission. This is the same powertrain in like the CLA 45 and the GLA 45 Mercedes models, and it's going to be the base engine in the Emira as well. Now, as for pricing, the Emira reportedly will start around $77,000 for a base model, although this is the first edition Emira, and it has a sticker price of around $96,000 because it has all the goodies. Lotus tells me that deliveries of these first edition Emira models to customers will start later this year, third quarter or fourth quarter of this year. They will start entering US customer hands. And as for competition, well, it's probably the Porsche Cayman. That's the biggest competitor to this car in terms of sizing, ethos, price point, power. But I guess you could also figure the C8 Chevy Corvette is probably competition, and so is maybe the Jaguar F-Type. That's probably the competitive set for the Lotus Emira. But anyway, next up, let's move on to all the interesting quirks and features of the Emira, and there are quite a few. Starting with the key, which is this kind of cool looking rectangle. It says Lotus on one side. You flip it over to the other side, there are the buttons, including the trunk button is shaped like an Emira, which is pretty cool. The unusual thing about this key fob is on the side it says for the drivers. It actually says that on both sides if you look closely, for the drivers. Just a reminder that all those other cars, well, they aren't. Anyway, getting inside the Emira, you walk up to the door. This is the door handle. You push on the front part, and then the back part pops out, just like in an Aston Martin. Then you pull on the back part, and then you can open up the door. Now, one focus of the Emira was improved comfort and practicality compared to the Evora, which came before. And so Lotus is touting that the door openings in the Emira are larger to make it easier to get inside, and the door sills are narrower narrower, so there's less stuff you gotta climb over to get inside, and so that should help for comfort of getting in and out. Now, when you get inside, one of the most unusual things you will find is that some of the controls in this car come from Volvo, because Lotus's parent company Geely is also the parent company of Volvo, and so the turn signal stock is shared with Volvo. Same deal with the wiper stock on the steering column, and same deal with a few other things. The power mirror controls, that's straight out of Volvo. Also, the steering wheel controls, you can see on both spokes of the wheel, those are borrowed straight from Volvo vehicles. And this play pause button here in the center console, it's not exactly lifted from a Volvo, but the design is virtually identical. It's amazing. You get into this purpose-built British sports car and you see some controls from an XC90 family crossover. It's just an unusual result of globalization, I guess. But aside from a few Volvo controls in here, everything else looks very different from what you'd get in your XC90, starting with the start-stop button, which appears to be behind a cage here in the center console. What's that about? Well, you can actually lift up the cage. You lift it up, it reveals the start-stop button, and then you can press it to start the car. Or if you don't want to lift it up, you can just stick your finger through the cage and the car is started. Now, you can also see that this Emira has the 6-speed manual transmission. Like I said, you can get this or a 6-speed automatic, but this has the manual, the driver's transmission. And check this out. Under the center console, you have exposed shift linkage. So you look down there while you're shifting and you can see the mechanics actually doing the work, which is a pretty cool thing to have exposed in the car. I wish they could expose it even more, like you get in a spiker where it's just completely open and you can see the shifting, but this is the next best thing and it is quite cool. Now, it's also worth pointing out this car still has hydraulic steering rather than electric steer-by-wire, so it is old school manual transmission and hydraulic steering and a gas-powered engine. No hybrid or electric yet. But anyway, moving up in the center console from the gear lever, you can see this cool drive mode switch. You move that up or down to change drive modes. I'll get into that more in a little bit. You also have your climate controls here, which are fixed buttons and they're kind of cool. The control to direct air has a little race car helmet driver on it, which is a neat little touch. And the control to turn on recirculating air has an image of an Emira rather than a generic boring car. Some kind of nice labeling in there to make it more special. And speaking of unusual labeling, how about the fact that the little switch on the climate vents says Emira? It's not just a generic switch, Emira, and that's on all 4 climate vents in the interior. So every time you adjust the airflow, direct it, you're touching Emira. But anyway, the next important thing to discuss here is, of course, the center touchscreen. You get a 10.2-inch center touchscreen in the Emira, a touchscreen in a Lotus. I guess the Evora had it too, but it seems crazy when you think about Lotus's ethos of simplifying, making cars lighter. It was hard to get power windows in one of these 10 years ago, and now you got a touchscreen, and it's a pretty good one. The home screen is great. You have 2 separate areas where you can cycle through 2 separate displays and configure them to show pretty much exactly what you want, which is nice to see. You also have wireless Apple CarPlay in this car, Lotus coming into the modern era, and of course you have Android Auto as well. And there are some cool performance things that you can see in the infotainment system, like your current G-forces or the horsepower and torque that you're currently using. My favorite, though, is the tire pressures. You can go into this tire pressure screen and it shows you the exact tire pressures down to the 10th, but then it also just says tire pressures are good over on the side. So if you don't want to actually look at the tire pressures, you can just look at the general overview that the car gives you. One other interesting thing in this screen, you can use the climate controls in the screen as well. You tap this little area in the upper left and the climate controls pull up, even though you have physical climate controls just below the screen. A redundant control area in a Lotus. Again, who would have thought for a car that's all about adding lightness? And in fact, that's a little bit of a drawback of this car. The Emira weighs in at around 3,200 pounds, where a comparably equipped Cayman is around 3,000 pounds. The Emira is actually the heavier car, which isn't really in keeping with the Lotus philosophy. These have always been about taking stuff out, unnecessary items, removing them, making the car lighter, so you don't just have to jam power in to counteract an excess weight. But this car, well, you add creature comforts and frankly, you just make the car heavier. But the creature comforts are kind of nice. You have automatic wipers in this car, as you can see in the Volvo wiper stock. You have automatic headlights. Again, the Volvo headlight stock. You also have voice control in here. You can see this microphone button on the steering wheel activates it. And you have a nice digital gauge cluster behind the steering wheel, which gives you surprisingly good information. You can scroll through all sorts of stuff and part of your digital gauge cluster display, including your navigation screen, where you're headed, your music, your media. Stuff that I complain about not being able to see in Toyota models is here in a Lotus. It's nice to have, frankly. And this gauge cluster screen has another trick up its sleeve. It changes as you change drive modes. Okay, so there are 3 drive modes. The regular mode is called Tour, and the gauge screen looks like this. You flip the drive mode switch to go into the next one, which is Sport, and you can see the screen gets a little more focused. It turns red. A couple of displays show individual tick marks instead of sort of a general overview, but it's not that different. However, you flip the switch again and you go into race mode, and you can see the gauge cluster is now totally reorganized. It's prioritizing the gear you're in the middle instead of the speed you're in, since that doesn't really matter on the racetrack. And it's also showing you your tachometer, your engine speed, in a more focused way as well. That's your race mode gauge cluster display. Also worth pointing out, you go into race mode and it turns off traction control and stability control, so only go into that mode if you know what you're doing. But anyway, moving on from the luxury touches, let's go on to the rest of the quirks and features in here, starting with the seats. Now, these are fairly grippy sport seats. They're finished in Alcantara and they have some pretty nice bolstering, but they're not like crazy bucket sport seats like you see in some cars that really hug you in place. That's not really the purpose of this car, all out track focused. It's just supposed to be a driver's performance car, and these seats seem to match. In the center between the seats, you have cup holders, which is a new thing for a Lotus, and you also have a little storage compartment in here where you can stick stuff or plug in a phone to charge it. Now, as for interior room, Lotus told me that the goal was that someone who's 6'3", 6'4" like me should be able to sit in this car with a helmet on and still be comfortable. And so that's why the roof has kind of this bump out directly over the seats in order to accommodate a taller driver potentially wearing a helmet for racetrack use. Also, on the subject of interior space, there are no more back seats, as you can see. The Evora did offer rear seats, but that's gone from the Emira. Instead, you have cargo storage back here, which is actually relatively useful. It's a decent sized space, just not sized quite large enough for seats. But anyway, since I'm talking about the engine, let's talk about it a little bit more. 3.5 liter V6, and like I said, it's sourced from Toyota, and make no mistake, this is the engine in the Camry. This isn't some high performance Toyota powertrain in some special model in Japan. This engine is borrowed from the V6 Toyota Camry, one of the most boring cars on the market. But Lotus supercharges it, so 400 horsepower, which is a pretty healthy figure. I think the V6 Camry was like 270 or 300. This has a lot more than that. And of course, manual transmission, and this car is a lot lighter, so it's a lot more enjoyable than a V6 Camry. Now, this engine does say Lotus V6 on it, not Toyota, but we know. And one benefit of this powertrain is it adds reliability. As you can imagine, the Camry V6, a pretty reliable engine, as opposed to something that Lotus might concoct on their own, which you're not really sure if you can trust. And so I actually see this engine as a benefit in this car, even though it comes from a fairly traditional mid-size sedan. It also sounds surprisingly good. Take a listen to the Camry V6 revving in the Emira. Now, also worth pointing out, in this engine bay, you do have the cargo compartment back here, which is pretty decent sized. Surprisingly sizable cargo area where you can stick bags for a nice weekend, overnight, or an even longer trip if you want to. And that's especially good when you consider it supplements the cargo area in the car behind the seats, so you have some pretty decent cargo space in the Emira. Now, as for closing this cargo engine compartment lid, one drawback is you don't have a little handhold area on the inside, so to close it, you You have to go on the outside and put your fingerprints on the paint, which will annoy some people. Every time they close it, they'll have to wipe it off, but that's just how they designed it, unfortunately. And finally, moving up front in the Emira for a few other exterior quirks, one of which is that this front compartment doesn't open. I mean, it does open if you're at the Lotus dealership doing servicing on the car, but it's screwed down into place. You or I should not be opening this. It's basically fixed, so no extra storage up here. Now, as for the design of this car, I have to say, I think it's beautiful. A really gorgeous car with gorgeous lines. It's a really nice looking car, beautiful everywhere you look at it. I think Lotus did a fantastic job designing this car. Now, with that said, I think it's maybe just the littlest bit generic. You could tell me that this is a new McLaren or a new Maserati like the MC20 or an entry-level Ferrari, and I could frankly believe all of that. So even though it is really beautiful, it doesn't have any like really distinct features to it, which is a little bit of a drawback for a brand like Lotus that's kind of trying to get their name out there more, make themselves more of a thing, not having a more distinctive look. But regardless of distinctive or not, again, it really is beautiful, and I love looking at this car, and I am impressed with how it looks. Now, one other thing worth mentioning on the outside of this car is the tires. There are two different tires available. You get the Tour version of this car, and you get these Goodyear Eagle tires, which seem totally fine to me. But if you want a more aggressive performance tire, you can get the Sport version of the Emira, and you get a Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 tire. That's a pretty aggressive tire. It's approved for road use, and you can drive on the road with a Cup 2, but it's more of a racing-ish tire, and in weather, you'll definitely want to know what you're doing. For me, for my money, these Goodyears are just fine. All right, driving the Lotus Emira. There is a lot to say about this car, so I'm gonna try to condense it down. Now, unlike a lot of the press cars that I get from automakers that I have for a week, I only had this car for basically a half day, so I haven't had the chance to drive it that much, but I'm gonna give you my impressions. Okay. There are pros and cons to this car against a Cayman, and whenever I talk to someone who owns an Evora, that's the car that they usually were comparing it against, and they went with the more exotic Lotus for various reasons. So here's what I think this car does better than a Cayman. This is gonna sound sacrilegious, but I like this powertrain. Yes, I am saying that I like a Toyota Camry V6 more than a Porsche Cayman powertrain, but let me explain. This Camry V6, I've always felt, has been a pretty torquey engine, even in the Camry itself. It actually feels like it's got decent power and decent torque. That's not something I can always say about all versions of the Cayman. Even the GTS kind of feels like it's hurting for torque at the low end. Now, this only has 310 pound-feet, but it just feels less peaky and more kind of low torque available than the powertrain you get in a Porsche. And even though it is the Toyota Camry V6, it has been supercharged and it adds reliability like I mentioned. Now, one interesting drawback to this powertrain situation, I'm not as in love with the manual transmission in this car. I love that they do a manual, I think that's great, but it feels more notchy and definitely not as smooth as what you get in a Cayman. Now, the clutch still feels great, just like in a Cayman, but the gear action itself is just a little like stiffer, and not in a good way of being stiff. It feels like, I don't know, like it could be a little bit more smooth, a little bit more buttery, without having play. Now, the other benefit that this car has over the Cayman is it steers and handles a little bit better. Cayman does a great job, but Porsche has to build that car for every man a little bit more than Lotus does. This car is obviously going to be more of a focused sports car than a Cayman can be, because Caymans, you're still selling a lot of those with PDK to attorneys who just want to drive to work and look cool. And so you can't go too stiff on the suspension. This car has a stiffer suspension, so the ride quality is harsher than a Cayman, but you're benefited with the steering feel, this great hydraulic steering feel, and with a very precise steering. It changes directions very quickly. It's very good at that. And when you're going through harder corners, the car stays flat, the car stays planted, and you really feel like you're in a capable, very high quality car in terms of its handling ability. The other advantage the Lotus has over the Cayman is the exoticness of this. This car definitely turns more heads, it definitely is more exciting. However, that is, of course, also the Lotus's greatest drawback, is the brand. The Lotus brand is it doesn't have the reputation that Porsche has for quality, for longevity, for parts support, for reliability. Having the Toyota powertrain helps with some of that stuff, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of people stay away from this car because the Lotus dealership network is this weird cobbled together group of dealers that sell other stuff that decided to take a Lotus franchise, whereas Porsche is very professional, very serious. Also because we buy this car, we're not sure, is it going to be around in 5, 7, 8 years to provide parts and service support? I think there's a lot to like about this car in terms of improvement over prior Lotus models for the way it feels, for the luxury, but it's not a Porsche. It's not a C8 Corvette even. Those cars have an established dealer network, there's no concern about parts, and they're just pretty nice inside. So what do? You're in this segment, you want to spend 80, 90 grand on a mid-engine sports car, what do? Here's my answer. You buy this car if you fit two important things. Number one, you want something more exciting than a Cayman. I suspect a lot of the people who buy these have already had a Cayman, or they've already had an M3 or both, and they're not quite ready to make the jump into a Ferrari yet, and so they're like, what else can I get? Well, the answer is, let me try a Lotus. Number two, if you are willing to take the chance on a brand that is a little questionable. And if you're those two things, take the chance, get something more exotic, then this is the car for you. It certainly is fun to drive. I think it's very enjoyable and exciting behind the wheel, this car, just as much as a Cayman, if not more, but it's not for everyone. That's kind of the Lotus thing. It's fun, but it's not for everyone. But there will be a group of people who it's for, and now we have a Chinese company overseeing all this, which maybe makes us feel like it's gonna be around longer. This is a great car, it drives well, and I'm happy to get behind the wheel, and I think it's got a lot of great sports car benefits. And so that's the new 2023 Lotus Emira. This is an impressive car with great styling, a fantastic driving experience, an excellent powertrain, but the question with Lotus is always the same. Is it gonna be reliable? Is Lotus gonna be around to provide parts and support in the future? And those questions still remain with this car. But if you're looking for something more special than the usual Porsche or BMW, this is it, the Emira. And now it's time to give this car a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 63 out of 100, but this is one of those cases where the Doug score works really well because you can look at it a bit more closely to get a better feel for where this car really fits against rivals. Specifically, the Emira gets a 38 out of 50 in the weekend categories, which ties the C8 Corvette and the Porsche Cayman GT4, both of which are seriously desirable cars that put down some real performance numbers. And that underscores the Emira's fantastic performance car success. The Emira's weak spot is the daily scores, where it's low on practicality and technology, and it suffers from Lotus's not-so-great reputation for potential long-term quality. The Porsche Cayman is a better all-around car, but the Emira is great if you want something exotic and thrilling without spending big money for a McLaren or a Lamborghini.